Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to this lovely opportunity to hear Bernard talk about his work and his research, but for all of us to discuss what solidarity means in terms of retrieving and recording and remembering and conveying the Palestinian tragedy and story accurately and as a core part of what it means to give solidarity. And I'll explain that. We have many opportunities tonight, and that is the first. I'd like to start off by thanking PSC, Ben, Martial for helping to bring us all together. I hear there's a very large turnout this evening. So that's very good because we need to actually be talking about this a lot. I'm sure many of you follow the news. I know many of you PSC members follow the news every day and can see the Palestinian tragedy going on in such extreme and terrible manner. And before I hand over to Bernard, I'm going to talk about some of the campaigns that PSC is engaged with that actually, especially now for Gaza, there'll be an emergency meeting and protest, but I'll come back to that just at the end because there's two other things that it gives us the opportunity to do. I was looking at this history, I talked to Bernard about it the other day. We've worked in many collective things together in so many ways, but this is a terrible history and I'm practically allergic to it. So it's always very inspiring to see British trade unionists, activists, people in schools, and people all over the country that go and explore and learn about the Palestinian story. Many people have become interested again in the entire British Empire and the colonial stories and bringing them into our schools. And I would say that there's nothing more important and central to that education is Palestinian history. And that's because, as Bernard I know will be talking about, it's the direct connection and reason why people in this country, above all, need to be engaged and there's an outstanding debt. Colonial, with other countries, it's a legacy. It's what they've left behind, which is still present. With us, it's a living settler colonialism. And by people's knowledge and activity, they can raise awareness of this. And that's what will make the difference. Why do people, everyone has seen the attacks on those who give solidarity with Palestine. And I would say the best answer to that is to convey that history and why people in Britain must struggle until Palestine is free. It is Britain that took our sovereignty away as Palestinians. And so there's a special obligation here to keep campaigning and to make sure that the generations before are remembered, those who struggled, but also those in Britain that were making policy that did take our country away from us and denied us our right of self-determination. And I think the idea that we have a moment to reflect on how do we continue to convey this story, and not because at the moment they're trying to bury it. They're taking a lot of the material out of the archives in Israel so that the history of the Nakba, but Bernard's going to actually talk about the very important decades during the mandate period. And I think that is what people have to think about conveying, because it also brings the responsibility for solidarity. So that's my second. My third, the third opportunity it gives, and it gives all of us at PSC, is to thank Nina, who was a comrade who worked for many years, and PSC asked, and as we all knew, this campaigner, I'd like to just say a couple of things about her, and I hope Bernard will talk about her as well. I've just lost that one document. Here we go. Bear with me. Here we are. So Nina Franklin was a supporter to PSC, to Palestine, to many progressive causes, and is a colleague of many of us, and recently passed away. So we'd like to dedicate this event to her. She died on the 24th of August. She was, and this is just some of the things that she did, she was extraordinary force, and that force I hope remains with us. She was Bristol NUT Secretary, NUT National Executive Member, NUT President, NUT NEU Regional Officer, and constant and steadfast for Palestinian rights. And she's been on one of the delegations more than once, I think, and was planning to go again in autumn, which I didn't know about, taking her local group, but classic Nina, classic Nina. So I'd also like to just flag some of the many events that PSC convene and hold, most of which Nina would be part of, as we know. The first and most important is the Emergency Rally for Gaza, which is to lift the siege. It's this coming Tuesday, 1st of September at 6:30. PSC will, if that's right, Ben, be sending out more information and putting it on the website and sending an email around about it with details. And there's certain actions, which is to email your MPs, of course, and to demand, or it's very nicely says, politely says here, asks for an arms embargo. There is also for UK students and for faculty, I think, demand universities UK ensure complicit investments are raised with all UK university executive heads. That's a nice little autumn project. Also to support the campaign, PSC, to join and be a member. There's nothing more important to do than just to join with all of us, because working together is what makes the work possible. So I'm going to hand over to Bernard, and I think I'm going to come back after you start, Bernard. I have some questions. One of my questions to you, just to flag it so you know it's coming, but I hope you raise it, is the many decades of your work on Palestine and on education and on trade unions and how these came together. So I'd like to ask you to reboot the late 70s. We talked about that a bit. And because I think one of the really essential things is to give some resources to the younger generation that are coming along and looking at what kinds of things really made a difference. So with that, I'd like to ask you to start off on this terrible but critical history. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karma, and thank you for that introduction. Just to add to your comments in relation to Nina Franklin. Nina was a comrade of mine for more than 30 years, working in the National Union of Teachers principally. She was a dedicated socialist and a very principled person, not only working on behalf of members of her own union, but giving support to others in struggle and in campaigns, and particularly involved in campaigns in support of women's rights and also in terms of anti-racism. She was very forthright in defending and supporting campaigns like the Black Lives Matter and played a very crucial role over many decades in that respect in her hometown, in her home area of Bristol. She was, as you said, quite rightly, Karma, engaged not only as an NUT, as a trade union activist, but she'd continued that activity through her retirement. She had taken up inside the Labour Party the need to take up the question of Palestine, and she had been organising delegations and visits through the Labour Party, and that was very important, something that I think is vital. And as you rightly said, she was about to take another delegation in November, but tragically that has not come to pass. I know that her loss is not only our loss, but I've had messages from Palestine, from comrades in Palestine, and indeed from the trade unions in Cuba who knew her well too, all of whom saying how much they regret and express their condolences and sorrow at their loss, but in doing so very loudly celebrate the role that she played and the commitment that everybody has to continue to fight for the ideals and the principles that she embodied and that she lived. So I'm very pleased that we are, as it were, acknowledging Nina's role in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and as an internationalist and as a socialist and as a trade unionist. So thank you for having said that. I want to talk in this section about the Britain's legacy in Palestine to give a kind of general overview, and I'll try and touch on some of the comments that Karma has made about kind of work in this area. But one of the things I want to kind of start off by saying is that I think that the campaign in terms of Palestine rights is very much linked into the sentiments and the politics that have been expressed in the Black Lives Matter campaign. Because what is coming very much to the fore in that is a recognition of the distorted character of the history that is taught in schools in Britain and the education politically that we receive, the kind of mythologizing of the role of the empire. We even have some historians who think that the empire was an entirely positive thing, that in actual fact, what it did was it enhanced people's lives in countries like India and elsewhere. And they fail to recognize, indeed refuse to recognize, in my view, the absolutely atrocious, calamitous consequences of the empire and what it actually meant for people living there. I mean, just as one kind of indicator, and we're talking about Palestine, I know, but it's something which is very much kind of coming to the fore. And that is the role, for example, of Winston Churchill in India and the famine in Bengal, which he was instrumental in bringing about, which led to the loss of more than 4 million lives in India, something which is glossed over in terms of talking about history. And it's one of the many kind of features that I think it's important that we actually restore the truth and acknowledge what did happen. So that is what I want to talk about in relation to Palestine. What was the situation? Because very, very clearly, the consequences of that live through to today's experience for the Palestinian people and remain a massive challenge. In my view, the Palestinians have had to face three separate empires, if you like. In the beginning, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and in very large measure, the United States Empire. All of those, I think, have been actually critical to kind of shaping and forming how the Palestinians could seek to establish their rights and fight for their lives, for their rights and campaign. And people talk about colonialism as something kind of quite distant, but of course, colonialism and imperialism are two sides of the same coin. And I think one of the things that I would like to say at the outset is that people need to have an appreciation of the scale of the actual nature of British imperialism at the beginning in 1917 when the British occupied Palestine and what happened. The British Empire was absolutely colossal. As you can see from this map, I hope, it covered nearly a quarter of the globe's surface and ruled nearly a quarter of the world's population. It was absolutely enormous. So when we think about the British Empire at the time of 1917, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, at the time of the British occupation of Palestine, we ought to think in terms of the United States' dominance in the world today, and that the British domination at that point in time was something equivalent to that, as you can see. It's also important just to looking at this map to recognize some features of it in respect of the empire. For example, the extent to which in 1919, after the First World War, the British Empire stretched virtually from the north of Africa, from Egypt, right down to the toe of South Africa, all the way through the continent. And also, of course, India, which was a critical part of the British Empire, Australia and New Zealand. So you can see how vast it was. And I want to draw emphasis and explain why that's important, because I think these things were components of the way in which Britain made decisions in respect to Palestine. Of course, they had a vision, not a vision, but a perspective for what they wanted to do in relation to Palestine, but it was premised on their imperial objectives and their imperial priorities. And that included, for example, the fact that they wanted to maintain a form of communication with the rest of the empire. Vitally, they were exploiting India in particular with all sorts of different ways in terms of trade. The British shipping, for example, in the world constituted more than 52% of the globe's of the whole world's shipping entity. So you can see it was colossally important. And as you can see from that map, if you look at the area here from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea, that was a vital communication line. So Suez was a critical point in that. And at the tip of the Red Sea, of course, Aden, another point of interest for the British, with the occupation in the very early part of the 19th century, 1830s, of Aden itself. And all of that was really tied into ensuring that Britain had a viable form of communication with the rest of the empire. So it's that kind of colossal sense of the power that the British Empire had that I think it's important for us to register in understanding that. And the third component of this interest was the beginnings of a commitment, or not a commitment, but the beginnings of an interest in the issue of oil. From the early part of the 20th century, the British were desperate to try and find sources of oil because they did not want to be dependent on the United States of America. And when they discussed these issues in the British cabinet in the First World War, the question of having access and control over oil was considered to be a vital part of their strategy for the whole of the Near East, the whole of the Middle East, as they called it. They wanted to be able to guarantee they had a source for oil that they could draw on. Now, in addition to that, of course, there were other countries that were interested in gaining control in the area. And one of the things, if you like, to make the linkage is that those countries that were operative and involved in looking to intervene in the area are still the same ones that we see around today. We saw President Macron going to Lebanon. I don't believe for 1 minute that he was going to show humanitarian concern for the tragedy that happened in Beirut. I think it was much more that he wanted to kind of re-establish France's links, as they see it, with Lebanon as a part of their kind of colonial sphere of influence. You see in Syria the intervention of various countries, including Turkey again, looking to intervene in that region. And of course, the United States of America, which although at the beginning of the 20th century was not directly involved, certainly expressed an interest. And as an interesting aside, if you like, at one stage, the British considered allowing the United States to have the mandate for Palestine because they were unsure whether they had the resources to sustain it. So you can see that all of these international imperial powers still today are hovering around the region, intervening in the region, changing the governments, denying the people the right to assert their own independence, their own autonomy, to express their right to self-determination in Iraq and other parts of the Near East as a whole. The British Empire, as I said, was one which was absolutely huge. And the debates within the cabinet that led up to the signing of the Balfour Declaration in 1917 expressed all of these kind of views and had all of these sorts of opinions. But I want to say from the outset, and this is one of the things that I tried to present in my book, is it's very important that people appreciate that from the 19th century and through the early part of the 20th century, the Palestinians had a clear vision that they wished to exercise their right of self-determination. And they expressed it in various ways in the Ottoman Parliament, in newspapers that they had, in political organization that began to be formed and began to be shaped. And I say this because one of the kind of presentations that you have of the whole story of Palestine is that Palestinian national self-determination was really a response to Zionism, rather than being authentic, indigenous, and flowing from the aspirations of the Palestinian people themselves. So I think it's important to say that, because I think it's important to have that sort of perspective. And in that respect, in relation to what their aspirations included, it was very clearly the case that they wanted to have a area of that whole area independent. And this was the basis on which they conducted negotiations with the British through the correspondence between McMahon and Hussein. And this was a declaration that they made in 1915. In other words, well before the Balfour Declaration, the Arab peoples of the region had a view of what territory they wished to see independent. And this was contained in written form in the letters that were circulated. But I hope you can see from the map that it very clearly includes the whole of the Arab Peninsula. It includes all of Jerusalem, all of Palestine, all of Lebanon, all of Syria, and so on and so forth. There was no question that in their perspective, and this is one of the sort of debates that comes up, it was for the independence of the whole Arab region that they were campaigning, that they were seeking to establish. In terms of the protocol itself, as I said, it was a very firm basis on which they were seeking independence. But we know that the British continuously were intervening in this whole process, were seeking to create divisions and to play a role in so doing. And of course, this came from their whole colonial experience, which we saw operating in other parts of the globe and other parts of the world. Just to look at, for example, the British cabinet that was operating within at the time, you can see some of the figures who were in the cabinet that took the decision about the Balfour Declaration. Usually at this point, if we've got if we're meeting together, I hold a quiz just to ask which of these people you recognize. Usually the people at the top you can recognize, or most people recognize fairly quickly. Reading from the left, David Lloyd George, in the middle, Arthur Balfour, and to the right, Lord Milner. But along the bottom, these figures are slightly less kind of clear as to who they are, and people remain unsure. But I think in some ways, they say a lot more about the politics of the cabinet, the politics of Britain at the time, and indeed the legacy that they contributed. Lord Curzon was one, but further to that, the gentleman, the second from the right, with the light grey beard, is Jan Smuts from South Africa. He was a member of the cabinet and of course was, in a sense, one of the progenitors of apartheid in South Africa. So the whole question of divide and rule and the way in which British imperialism operated was very much part of his vision of the world. The person to the left of that was a member of the Labour Party, Henderson. So the Labour Party was a member of that cabinet because they supported the war effort in 1914, and they joined in the support for the British effort, and he was party to that whole process. And the figure on the right, I think, is one of the real ogres, I would consider personally, of this cabinet, none other than Edward Carson, a leading political figure, of course, who supported the opposed strongly Irish independence, Irish Home Rule, who was engaged in supporting the Loyalists' breakaway and the declaration of opposition to any form of Home Rule in Ireland. And of course, also on his CV is the fact that he was the barrister who prosecuted Oscar Wilde when Wilde was being persecuted. But I think it's interesting because I think that cabinet says a lot about the kind of character of the British imperial rule and what they were about. There was opposition, of course, very vocal opposition, particularly from Edwin Montagu, the only Jewish member of the cabinet, who was a Secretary of State for India, a very, very important post in the British kind of hierarchy of positions. Montagu actually went so far as to completely condemn the proposal for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. saying that it was motivated by the British government's anti-Semitism, that what they were seeking to do was to create a situation where Jews would face further persecution because people would be saying that they had a place to go to, therefore they should leave and they should go out. And this is not somebody who, if you like, was an anti-imperialist, a revolutionary, or by any stretch of the imagination. He was a firm imperialist, but he believed that this was a completely erroneous thing to do. And I think it's important to remember these debates and people who were involved in it, because you know, at the present point in time, it's considered that you can't debate the political nature of the Zionist organizations, what their objectives were and what they were seeking to do. But here at this point in time, Montagu was strongly opposed to what was going on in the cabinet, and said, in fact, that in his view, it was a minority of people in the Jewish community in Britain who supported this whole notion and was strongly opposed to it. The British, however, steamrolled this through. And of course, from that point on, the Palestinians were faced with a situation where they were under occupation. People talk about the mandate. I'm sort of slightly reluctant to use the expression mandate because it's presented as though it's a sort of neutral kind of role that the British were playing, somehow acting as sort of umpires or people who were kind of playing some kind of conciliatory role, trying to resolve the problems as they perceived it. That wasn't, I don't think, a correct, or isn't a correct way, I don't think, of presenting it. This was an occupation, a military occupation. But as an occupation and as an act of colonialism that was taking place, I think it's important to recognize that it was not just about that physical domination and suppression of Palestinian ambitions and Palestinian rights, but it's about the way in which that role went on to distort and have serious impact on the political, social, and economic character that existed. Because what took place was the way in which the economy developed was one that disadvantaged those areas of the economy which were predominantly engaged, or Palestinians were predominantly engaged with, to advantage those which the new Zionist immigrants were engaged with, to create a situation in which critical sectors of the economy were actually appropriated and the Palestinians were denied the right to have control over them. For example, the Dead Sea chemicals industry, which was beginning just at this point in time, but the World Bank reported just a few years ago that it's a colossal loss to the GDP, to the production of Palestine, somewhere in the region of 14–16% of the GDP as a consequence of the denial of their rights to exploit that. So what we can see is that the colonialism of the British, the imperialism, was not just about a physical occupation and suppression, but was about intervening in the social and economic character of the country, in my view, in a way which inhibited and distorted the capacity of Palestine to actually construct its national campaign, its national objectives. We saw a shift, a decisive shift in the 1930s, and I'll draw my remarks to a close. In the 1930s, when there was a response to Britain, a challenge to Britain. But here again, whereas in the early part of the British occupation, there were objectives. In the 1930s, there were others that they were preoccupied with, like Italy's intervention in Abyssinia and its takeover, and the threat that they perceived that posed to the Red Sea actually being controlled by the government. I want to just perhaps conclude by saying that all of these things which I've been referring to are still today part of the scenario that confronts the Palestinians. The way in which the fragmentation of Palestinian life took place as a result of the British occupation, the way in which it distorted the capacity of Palestine to organize, the way in which socially, for example, people were displaced from the land as a result of the sale of land that took place, and the way in which they were peripheralized and moved into precarious areas of the economy in such a way that the kind of social organization that is vital to the constructing of a national perspective was actually inhibited by the British. So right the way through, what we see from Britain is an intervention in all aspects of Palestinian life in such a way that made that challenge even more difficult, and we can see is reflected today. I think it's vital that we talk about this, that we get out the message and understanding of this, not in order to feel guilty about what the British did in the past. We were not responsible for that, but in order to ensure that we are not complicit in that situation continuing for the future. So I think it's critically important that we recognize that, just as with the campaign on Black Lives Matter, the campaign for Palestine is about continuing the struggle against colonialism and imperialism and the denial of the Palestinian rights.
Thank you, Bernard. That was fantastic. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, which you just did, and in such a short time, because it's such a dense history. And having read your work, the one thing I forgot to do, which is this amazing book published by Verso, by Bernard, about this period, which he spent a lot of time in the archives, but just in order to not get lost in it. It's so dense, and there's so many horrific colonial betrayals and betrayals of trust and absolute abnegation of obligation, but also just terrible lying to us. So, and the worst of it was they took the land under and put it under the mandate. And that's one of the first questions. I have 3 questions. Maybe we can bundle them together if that's okay with you, because it kind of follows up on the things that you highlighted, which I think were really the key elements. And I'll even come to the gallery of villains that you have there, because it's endless. There's another one, but you've kind of found and how much do we need to know? And I think that comes to the final question. But the mandate, which the Balfour Declaration was inserted into, also had the Article 22 and the Sacred Trust, which was about making sure that the peoples from those places would be free and had the right to their freedom and their right to self-determination. So inbuilt into it was already this colonial adventure, as well as the promises. And it was this, I think it was Sacred Trust. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the mandate itself. I wanted to ask you about that, but mostly also because while there was mandate in other countries, they imposed military and martial law at the same time. There's colonialism, and you said colonialism and imperialism. I'll get to the question, I promise. Colonialism, imperialism is 2 sides of the same coin. But I'd like to introduce another term here, because we've got a lot of terms of what's going on today. And we need to use a lot of them because there's quite an accelerated example of it. And that would be settler colonialism. Because I think and I wanted to ask you why you've chosen, in a sense, to put that definition aside. I mean, I know you use it, and it's clear there's apartheid, which is happening. But settler colonialism, it seems to me, also raises the issue of the forced displacement, expulsion of the Palestinians and what was building up over the 20s and 30s, and therefore the British police and army's response to destroy all resistance and claims for self-determination from the very beginning. So it's really about that language and how many words do you think we really need to use in order to explain what's going on today? And just touching that we're not living with a legacy, we're living with active colonialism. And so is settler colonialism helpful, and why or why not? Or, the terms of nationalism versus self-determination, etc. And the second is about the education and the work in education and in schools, and what parts of this are so absent. And as you rightly said in Black Lives Matter, everybody can see the absence of basic history and how people grow up with fairy tales and how painful and difficult it is to be told these fairy tales aren't true. So really the education has to start in school so that people realize why there's a struggle, what justice would look like, and actually change policy. And we know that needs to be done. So one is about that question about, of course, the national curriculum must include colonial history, and that's a campaign in itself. But there's the other side of the work that you did in the 70s, before I was in this country, in the 80s, around the unions. And I know PSC did a lot of these. They had education packs. And so it's not clear when this would happen, such a campaign to ensure that colonial history is taught. But also there's a lot of out of school activities and Saturday schools and evening schools. And the Palestinians did a lot of those because we had schools, UNRWA schools, and we had to have, the scouts and everything and education outside the school in order to educate our young people. So it's about that as the second question. And the third is about, it just goes back to those words, because I don't think it's a legacy in this case, because I think it's an existing settler colonialism that can be, that needs to be stopped, but also there is existing and active colonial projects, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at Afghanistan and other places. And so it's like, I don't like very much the term diaspora, because I think, given our status legally under our inalienable rights as recognized by the UN, we're not really a diaspora yet. There's these categories that aren't just categories. They're very important in terms of status about our inalienable rights that are maybe commonplace for people that know a lot about Palestine or that are active, but in a sense still has to be conveyed. So I think it was just 2.5 questions. And I'm going to give it back. And I just wanted to say thanks so much for, the villains. That was the last bit. The villains, we have this history of, in colonialism and in empire and today, which is, Colson was great, Colson is a villain. It's very upsetting that we have these things. I live in Oxford, so you can imagine everywhere, every street, all that gallery. And actually the young students here in the Student Society, Palestine Society, went into the archives and found out about these villains and found these very complex stories about them when they were young, before they went into the colonial service. But is it just to learn their role, and the role that they played was villainous? Because I'm thinking about a national education that's needed that goes beyond villainy, because it's all of us. If it's going to be a progressive and emancipatory education. So I'll stop there.
No, it's sorry. It's interesting what you were saying about Colston and the Rhodes statue in Oxford, obviously. I was looking up before we began what statues there were that might be worthy of considering whether they should remain where they are. And there's statues of people like David Lloyd George and Jan Smuts and people like that. And I think it would certainly be worth asking the question, and of course, more importantly, in a sense, Winston Churchill, asking questions about those statues. I'm personally, I think that they should be preserved, but perhaps removed from their places, but preserved in a way that explains to people who they were, what they did, what their significance was, and actually provides an opportunity, if you like, to engage with that education that you were talking about. And it seems to me that that's an important thing that we should be talking about and thinking. So I think the whole question of education is vital. This is a very kind of personal thing. I don't think education should be there to make people feel guilty, because current generations were not responsible for the actions of those who preceded them, and particularly when we know that it was the ruling class that was carrying out these things. It was those with power in those days, and it was not something endorsed, if you like, by the population generally. But I do think we have a responsibility in terms of the complicity of the government of the day for continuing to stay quiet, to not acknowledge the injustices that happen to the Palestinians, and not to be forthright in supporting the rights of Palestinians for self-determination and for rectifying the injustices that they suffered. If we are silent on that, then we are complicit, we are guilty of that. That is a different thing from saying we were responsible for slavery. We have to recognize it, understand it and analyze it, but also to challenge what the way in which it manifests itself in today's society. And that is the case, I think, with in relation to Palestine, the contracts that the British government has with arms companies to do with Israel, companies who are profiteering out of the wall, profiteering out of the occupation and so on. All of those things, I think, should be addressed and should be part of a campaign that challenges that. I mean, going back to your first question on the issue of the colonial settler using that terminology, I certainly do think that is an appropriate terminology. But I just want to qualify that by saying that the colonialism that took place in Palestine was different from some of the other colonial projects which the British had in a number of ways, in respect of countries like Australia, for example, where the indigenous people were literally wiped out, were driven away, but were not settled communities. The Palestinian society was really very much integrated into the more, the European economy, the global economy. For example, wheat from Palestine was actually sold to London brewers to brew beer in the 19th century. Oranges and fruit were exported to Britain. So there was a real developing economy and a real developing society that was existed in Palestine, which was actually, in my view, destroyed by what happened and what took place, and actually distorted that. And the other thing about the settlers, the Zionist settlers, was that unlike the colonial projects, let's say, of the north of America in the first instance, or Australia, these were not people who came from the imperial country itself in the main. They were people who came from Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So they didn't have a loyalty or any kind of umbilical cord that connected them to the imperial power in the same way. And in addition to that, the capital which they were able to import to develop was actually not drawn from in the main from Britain. It was drawn from other parts of the world, and it was drawn from the United States of America, for example. So this kind of interrelationship between the colonial settlers themselves and the imperial power didn't have that immediacy. And it was also the case that, unlike other initial stages of colonialism, there was a national project by the colonists themselves from the outset to create a state, to establish a state of their own, which was not the way in which things began in other parts of the colonial experience. So I think certainly colonial settlism was how we should define that. The thing that I think, and this is something I would really like to explore a bit more, is whether or not that term has the same weight now, because that settlement has taken place, that country exists. Whether one agrees with it having happened is a different question, but that country exists. So it's an expansionist, an aggressive, a repressive regime, which is actually suppressing Palestinian rights and so on. But I think it's almost got beyond the status of a colonial settler. It's an expansionist national entity that exists there. So I think it's kind of in a different phase of development, but notwithstanding that, the sort of actions that it is taking, the theft of land, the way in which the Jordan Valley has been stolen, the way in which the settlements are expanding, the way in which the rights of the Palestinians inside 48, inside the state of Israel, are denied, what is happening to the people of Gaza, what is happening in the refugee camps, all of those things are as a consequence of its politics and its reactionary nature. So I certainly think that is, you know, a development and a continuum from that, the nature of what that regime was and how it was established. I think all of these things, and going back to the initial thing about the question of legacy and so on. Legacy. I mean, I'll try and not to be offensive, but there was the High Commissioner in. I just read a book by James Barr called Lords of the Desert. I don't know if you read it, and there's a quote in there about the High Commissioner for Aden, who before he was leaving said that the only thing that the British would have to leave as a memento of their legacy was association football and the expletive F off. And that was all that they had to contribute, that was their legacy. Sadly, I think that's an underestimation of the consequences. It clearly is still there, still quite significant. And I think we need to develop education. Certainly, as you were saying, from the 1970s, we were involved in campaigning to raise issues of internationally what was happening and the way in which countries were developed. And they actually were distorted and deformed by imperialist activity. So people developed curricula where they were actually talking about what was happening in countries like Brazil or Cuba or other countries and what the consequences of that were. And I think that's the sort of thing we should be seeking to re-examine, particularly at this time when the whole question of the curriculum and what's happening in schools, the way in which examinations are conducted are being raised. And I think we should be looking to develop that kind of initiative.
Thank you. I think we have come, I'm following orders here, Bernard. So I'd just like to say thank you very much. I'd like to come back to the role that you play and many people play within Palestine Solidarity Campaign in terms of disseminating, organizing, you know, working around this education and knowing how important it is to convey that history. So I'm sorry I caught you with, I have a list of words I don't like, legacy, you know, etc. But there's something about Palestine, which is a particular account with the British story of colonialism, which is ongoing. And we didn't get a chance to go over many of the aspects of your book, which go to, you know, many of the laws that they're using around the expulsion and the Nakba, but also the colonial practices that went right across from India, Ireland, Palestine, the same individuals on one side. And we also didn't have time to talk about the resistance to it, which you have a good chapter on that early resistance to the project, this colonial project. Yeah, so it's time, I think, for questions. And Bernard, did you want to say anything in closing, Bernard? Was there any last, because I kind of took the floor from you for the very last wind up. Just a minute or two.
Yeah, no, I mean, I on this issue of colonial settlerism, it doesn't change my critique of the actions of the Israeli government if I think that there is a question mark over the continuity of that, because I think it doesn't change my criticism of the way they act, of the way they treat the Palestinians, of the political kind of trajectory that they're going on. And clearly in the era of Donald Trump, we're seeing moves to actually further weaken the potential of support in the Arab world for the Palestinians, with the UAE forming some sort of agreement with Israel and the potential for other parts of the Arab world doing that. And that whole nature of divide and rule, which we see continuing today, is reflected in that. So if I have a question mark over the issue of whether colonial settlerism remains kind of, has the same kind of significance, it's not in any way to diminish any of the political critique that I would make of it from other colleagues and other people in the political world or the academic world who would use colonial settlement as a terminology. It doesn't in any way kind of mean that I have a different perspective
No,
on what we should
no.
be doing campaigning wise, the adamancy with which we should champion the Palestinian cause, and the way in which we should carry out that campaigning. So that it's a question of whether the debate about what is the situation there now and how that can be responded to with the utter fragmentation and the way in which that is throwing up new debates about perspectives in terms of how Palestinians should respond to that is a question and a debate, I think, for another time, but is one that is there.
Thank you. I'm going to take some questions now. I want to thank you for the intervention. Do you want to be able to follow up with me on answering those questions?
Yeah.
That would be fantastic.
I'll mute and then.
Exactly. So Ben has been sending them to me. The first one is from Aisha, and it is on this very, of course, topic. Does British complicity in Israel's actions imply its colonial project continues by proxy? So, I mean, the short answer, I'll answer first and hand over to Bernard. And that the short answer is yes. There's a continuing complicity. I think beyond the complicity with the current arms sales and the current, I do think, in a slightly different aspect of looking at settler colonialism as an expansionist project and looking at how it makes invisible and wants to destroy, fragment, which we have now, the Palestinian people. It relies also on solidarity to take us back to that destruction, first of all, of our society, but the continued destruction of our society, which is happening everywhere, not just, not alone in the West Bank or Jerusalem or Gaza or Lebanon or Syria or further afield where there's Palestinians. And I think it's that framing that people can understand this as a continuum, because settler colonialism is about replacing and the project of the Great Israel. So Britain has been part of that settler colonial project from the beginning. And it really is the side that, whereas today people are saying, well, we don't really like colonialism anymore. Well, here it is. So people have a way to change current policy by pointing out that Britain is continuing a colonial project, not just in Palestine, elsewhere, but it's the continuation of the denial of our right of self-determination and our right to return to our homes from which we were expelled. And the settler colonial project, again, can be seen in the first act, which was to destroy all the villages so we couldn't return, because the UN resolution, of course, had it that all of us expelled from our homes and lands, of which we're the descendants, have the right to return home. But anyway, the question was, does British complicity in Israel's action imply its colonial project continues by proxy? And I was saying it's not by proxy, really, given Britain's particular history with Palestine. Bernard.
I'd agree with that. I think that certainly remains the case. I think one has to be added to that is the role of the United States of America, however. Essentially, I think in the 1950s, the role of British imperialism as the dominant force in the Near East came to an end with the Suez debacle, when the British and the French invaded Egypt, when President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. And the Americans took a different view and were opposed to it. And they, I think, ever since that date, essentially have displaced the British as the primary imperial power in that region. And you can see that obviously today with their actions in Iraq, with their alliances with Saudi Arabia, with their intervention in Syria, and with their relationship with Israel. So I think Britain is still there, but it is kind of like a lesser figure. But nevertheless, given its kind of historic role, that remains something that has to be answered for. And one of the things that kind of I think about is that in a situation in which Britain is leaving the European Union, leave that aside as a separate debate, but that if Britain starts to go closer to Donald Trump, depending, of course, on the presidential election, is it going to be the case that Trump is going to exact even more loyalty from the British for America's foreign policies in respect of the Near East region in relation to Israel and Palestine. In other words, is Britain going to finish up backing his so-called deal of the century, which we know is absolutely disastrous in terms of what would happen. So that's the only kind of addition that I would give to that. And of course, one of the things we never talk about, and I don't think ever is talked about, but that is that Britain ought to be talking about reparations to the Palestinian people, because after the Nakba in 1948, 250,000 people driven from their homes and lands, all of those lands, I mean, they should be returned, of course, that's the first point one would make, but there should be a restoration for that theft of capital, of homes, and so on. And we should be talking about reparations for the Palestinians, not just an apology.
I agree, and I think that notion, I'm going to go through the next two questions I have, because actually they're again relevant to what we're just talking about. One is, how do we compare colonial legacy in Palestine to its legacy elsewhere? And the second is a question from Blake. Is it relevant to the Palestinian experience what Britain's motives were? I can imagine a Palestinian saying, it doesn't matter, it is the fact of the denial of our self-determination that matters. We need a Palestine-centered perspective, not a British one. So I'm going to answer that in reverse order and to say, unfortunately for us Palestinians, British history is Palestinian history by this brutal and violent military force that came in 1917 when Allenby came into Jerusalem, imposed martial law and started to destroy our polity. There is indeed, and in fact, there's a chapter in Bernard's book, but there's much work done on the Palestinians' response, resistance, creativity, ingenuity, the richness of our society, and how that continued in spite of exile, in spite of enforced, and continues until today in a way that we always continue to argue for their core principles of self-determination and return. So there's quite a lot of, but I think it's important we're in Britain. It's the British PSC. It is internationalism that we're talking about. But when we want to look at the history of the Palestinian people, it is fatally intertwined with British history. And I think that's one of the most important things that have come out from recent campaigning of a new generation, is this understanding that it's not a history that was happening far, far away, but that in fact, British history is the colonial story. And so that's why it's not for me to be begging to be included in the national curriculum. It is the British story, is an imperial story, but it also is a colonial story which had lethal effects on a people that is ongoing. It's an ongoing emergency and crisis. Of course, I mean, to bring it to the legacy in other places, you know, there's something about this which has been imposed on us, which is very, I would say, imposed in a way to continue that kind of internalization of colonial activity, which breaks up, you know, one against another. And there's a apology, you know, there's this great campaign going for the Amritsar massacre and to get an apology, and campaigning on that from Southall and other places. But I don't think it's slavery or the Amritsar. And I'm sure in a national curriculum, we couldn't cover the crimes. There'd be so many, we'd have to be in school for at least 30 years to actually understand all of the things that happen. But what unites that is a progressive anti-colonialism and internationalism that says, we must know what the previous generations did, because all of us as internationalists have to solve this together. But once you know the facts of these generations, of the Nakba, of what happened in British colonial history and imperial history, actually it brings you to understanding what justice would look like. And I think that does involve reparations, and I think it does involve apologies, but it needs to be undertaken in a national way, both in this country and internationally. And of course, we had a lot of support, and we continue to have a lot of support from the rest of the world in solidarity. You know, the people are with us and with our cause because of the ongoing colonial experience. So that was Blake's, and then the colonial legacy, the aspects I would say to that question, to compare it, there's something ongoing now. I'm not saying that there's very heavy, costly legacies in countries across the world, from the colonial, and reparations and understanding and realizing how they destroyed those societies and continents even, and left it in the way we see it today, and the way people are overcoming, and the brilliance is incredible. So I'm not saying the legacies don't have immediate effect and impact, but there's something distinct about the sovereignty of Palestine and what was taken from us by the British and given away or stolen, really. That means that the legacy is an active colonial situation, which gives a rationale of collective action, to respond to it.
It was interesting. One of the things working on the book was looking up the anti-colonial colonial struggles that were taking place. And it was interesting to look at the extent to which people engaged in those struggles actually related to each other. For example, I read a whole account about how the Indian community in New York organized an annual kind of festival to celebrate Indian independence when they were campaigning for it. And they had as some of their principal speakers, speakers from Ireland. And they talked obviously about the fight that the Irish were involved against British imperialism and the activity that they were taking. And in Ireland, there was a debate in the end of the 19th century among some of the parties to actually stand Indians in constituencies in Ireland where they would get elected, so they would have a voice inside the British Parliament. So what is very clear is that those who were the victims of imperialism, who were suffering from the colonial impression, actually understood each other's concerns and had that sense of solidarity. So I think you're right in saying that. I think in a sense, I won't say it doesn't matter, but it's the methodology, it's the way in which imperialism operated, it's the way in which colonialism functioned, the way in which it denied people's rights and people's lives, that it's important. And there are many examples that one could find, but one could do it in a way that demonstrated its applicability to other conditions, other circumstances, other situations. And I'm sure, that we could do that. And of course, the question of the legacy of British imperialism, of course, is still there today. Ireland is not united, full stop. It was, of course, you could look back actually and say that the origins of the situation in Ireland were in part as a result of colonial settlers being brought in by the British in the north of Ireland to displace the most rebellious of the Irish, fighting against the English at the time, and the splitting of Ireland was, a deliberate strategy that they involved in. Cyprus, another example where division was brought in. South Africa, another example. So, as you say, the legacy is still there. It's still very much present. And of course, you only have to look at the situation in Australia, the position of the indigenous peoples, the First Nation of Australia, the First Nations of Australia, and the way in which they have suffered as a result of British imperialism, British colonialism. So the legacy is it's very sharp and very distinct and critical in terms of Palestine, but it is clearly there in other areas of the world too.
I mean, we've got our last question. I've had a few emails saying this is the last and we're going to close now. And it goes on the map making because it's about the United Arab Emirates. Because the other thing the British did everywhere was make these lines and set people against each other and break up peoples and all kinds of terrible criminal and separate, they talk about this a lot when you look at enslaved people and how they would separate families. The way that that's ongoing today in so many parts of the world, the colonial practices that come out of those boundaries and those borders that were made. But this last question, it says it's a good question to end on, so I think we're going to end on this one. which is how do we resist the normalization of ties with Israel, especially after the UAE deal? And from my side, I'm not going to say this isn't important. What I would say matters is this kind of responsibility which goes beyond protesting for those that care. And that's why this history is very important, because this cause and this struggle will go on. And the Palestinians will continue to struggle for their rights, and we will continue until we achieve them. Now, the role in and what we stand with, and so many people stand with us, is to convey this story. You know, whatever was signed there to normalize doesn't change the fact, unless they wipe and make it disappear in the news. We've seen that with Gaza. So the voice and conveying these stories, which people may say, oh, I know this history, I don't want to go over this history, but actually it's essential, because we're so dehumanized in the press. We're made so invisible, and as if it doesn't matter if it's a game, as if it's somewhere else. And the actual story of what's going on every day, just behind the headlines and the screens. And as I said, the many, many days, this was not covered in the mainstream press. I know a lot of people don't rely on it anymore, but still it's a battle that we cannot give up, the mainstream press, because it needs to be a concerted effort to achieve justice for us. And the more that it becomes, you know, something that's a specialist knowledge of people that care, the role of solidarity I see here again is conveying these to others and to make this a shared understanding of what's going on and why this won't work, and why we need justice. So that's in a sense where I think I'll close, but I'm going to ask Bernard to say the final word on that. And thank you for coming.
I mean, clearly, what we see at the present point in time is an aggressive policy operated by the Israeli government, which is continuing to repress the Palestinians. And we're seeing, with the move of Donald Trump to endorse the building of the settlements, the expansion of the settlements, the theft of land, we're seeing that actually being pushed through. And it does, I think, cause grave concern that that is something which is actually there on the agenda and is being presented, and that countries like the UAE and other countries in the region are talking about entering into negotiations with Israel. The UAE claiming that they had stopped the deal of the century and the appropriation of additional land by the state of Israel, which of course is completely untrue. Israel will ignore that. And yet we're seeing other countries in the region like Oman and others talking about engaging with the Israelis. And what worries me is that the situation will become to be accepted. The notion of normalization is what is becoming the dominant sort of discourse, if you like, that these things are part of the landscape and something that we should accept. And I think it's clearly incumbent on us not only to tell the truth about what has happened in the past, but what is happening today, and to alert people to this gross injustice. When apartheid was defeated in South Africa, I always say there were three components. One was the struggle of the black majority in South Africa. The second was a weakening of the position of the white ruling class, who came to the conclusion they couldn't continue as they had done. But the third component of that was the international solidarity, which was built, that had pressure that brought to bear. And that's why I think the campaign for boycott, disinvestment and sanctions is something that we have to bring forward all the time. I think we have to put pressure on the British government and to build a mass campaign in this country, which is actually going to unite people, bringing the whole of the student movement together, the whole of the trade union movement together, the mass of society, to assert the rights of the Palestinian people and to give solidarity and support, because without a doubt, the Palestinians themselves showing incredible courage and continuing to be steadfast in their resistance to what they have suffered as a result of the policies of the Israeli government. I think there is a responsibility on us to educate ourselves, to educate others, and to engage in an active way in campaigning and building a mass united campaign in the same vein that the anti-apartheid movement was, that has the impact of forcing the British government not just to apologise or give reparations, but to be an active supporter of Palestine in fighting for its right to self-determination.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bernard. I was very, very, very moving. And I've heard you many, many times over the years, but this is a very nice opportunity to look both at the work that you did recently and all of this research, but also the history of your own organizing, which comes from that internationalist position and internationalist stance. And, you know, Nina as well, this meeting is dedicated to her. And that was her position: internationalist, anti-racist, progressive. So it's very opportune that we're on a PSC platform, because those are the principles that Palestine Solidarity Campaign has always stood for: internationalist, progressive, anti-racist, and trying to build a broad coalition right across society, because this is something that every British child and adult needs to learn about and know about, so that we can get closer towards justice in our struggle. So I'll just mention at the very end, I don't know what, I had a list of things I was meant to mention, but I think I mentioned them before, but I really want to mention the emergency meeting on Gaza, which is next Tuesday, and to thank everybody for coming. And there's a range of educative materials, there's Bernard's books, there's lots of articles. So I think if you're in touch with PSC, Marcia will have some of them. I'm going to send some to him. There's very, very specific articles about the Colonial project and how that worked right across different continents with the same apparatus. There's lots of very helpful things, especially for people that are campaigning today. So we can send that across. And someone from PSC is, yes, that's it. So thank you, Bernard. That was just a lovely evening and very informative. Thanks so much.